funny. There was a nice hush that just so everyone, thank you so much for coming today. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Ashley Gearhardt, who's Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Michigan. We're so excited to have her here today. Ashley has really led and pioneered the field focused on food addiction and the developing the concept that like foods can be addictive. So it's had a major impact already, and we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I feel like there's so many people here I've interacted with online that I feel like I know because of the pandemic. I'm like, I've seen pictures of your children or like read your reports for tenure letters or things. And I'm like, it's to see people. It's lovely. This is my first in-person talk since the pandemic started. And I'm so thrilled to not be anxiously saying, can you see my screen? Can you see am I on? And it's like, oh, I just get to be here with you all and not talk to a blank room. So yes, I'm Ashley Gearhardt. My training was an alcohol addiction researcher in a kind of bar lab, simulated bar lab like you all have at Yale University. And I started doing alcohol work and addiction mechanisms and got really fascinated by the parallels I was seeing with my other advisor, who is Kelly Brownell, who does work on food and obesity and the food environment. And I was treating individuals who had binge eating disorder and bulimia, and I was just seeing the craving, the reward, the emotion dysregulation, all of these things just felt so shared. So I was really interested in applying what I knew about addictive substances in the realm of alcohol to understand whether some of these processes are driving forward these massive increases in diet-related disease and binge eating that we've seen since about like the late 1970s, 1980s. So I like to see if my clicker will work. Let's see. I think the screen might be frozen too. Maybe. Oh no. Okay. We're on. Yeah, it's working.
I clicked it once to test it and it worked.
Okay.
You might have to use the mouse. Sorry.
That's fine. We'll make it work. So I like to think about how we create addictive substances. Addictive substances are man-made processed substances. There is no wine river, although that sounds nice on like a lazy day. You're just going down wine. There is no cigarette tree. We take naturally occurring substances and we process and refine it in a way that it becomes so potent that for some individuals, they start to develop a compulsive pattern of intake that they can't get a hold on, even if they know that it's killing them. And so, this is kind of one of our classic addictive substances. We have the tobacco leaf that has nicotine in it. And we, for a long time, would do hand-rolled cigarettes where we would dry them and cure them. And we would take the dried leaves and wrap it up by hand and smoke a cigarette. When that was the way that we got nicotine, not a lot of people smoked cigarettes. It just was, kind of bulky and you had to hand roll it. And you could only do a couple in a minute. But through technology, we developed an industrial cigarette roller where we went from doing 2 or 3 a minute to 10,000 cigarettes in a single minute. And this technological advance allowed for an industry to come in and create these products and optimize them through the role of additives that took the nicotine and amped it up even further. So now we have 4,000 chemicals in every cigarette, with the most prevalent additives being sugar, cocoa, and menthol for the somatosensory flavor profile. There's extra nicotine added. There's additives that kind of numb the throat so you can suck the smoke in more deeply into your system. And so it gets more rapidly into the brain. And through this ultra processed industrial tobacco product, we saw the increases in cigarette smoking go up by over 1,000%. And when all the cigarettes became convenient, heavily marketed, and easily accessible and optimized, we saw the amount of disease related to cigarette smoking escalate dramatically as well. So then I think about our food environment. Our reward and motivation systems have been very shaped through evolutionary processes to worry that we're not getting enough calories. Famine was our biggest threat, still is in many parts of the world, for most of our human experience. And remembering substances that had a high caloric impact was really helpful for our reward system. We are kind of evolutionarily designed to find sweet taste that signal the availability of sugar in a product really rewarding. Same thing with fats, calorie-dense macronutrient. We have this recall, we have this reward response to that creamy fat flavor. But for most of human existence, these foods were hard to come by, they were pretty rare, and the biggest bang for our buck that we could get when it came to things like sugar and fat were fruits like bananas or berries, or nuts or honey down a buffalo, right? There was no drive-through. And so these were high effort to access and really not that potent. And they come combined with things like protein and water and fiber that makes it, it takes longer for them to eat, takes longer for them to absorb into our system. But again, technology has allowed us to strip the sugars and the fats and the highly rewarding ingredients that our brain evolved to find appealing and refine them into really potent substances like sugar, like high fructose corn syrup, like saturated fats, butter, lard, trans fats. So now we have this potent, refined version of these substances that we are meant to find rewarding. And we combine them into millions and millions of different, unique, ultra-processed packages that have levels of refined carbohydrates and fats that far surpass anything that occurs in nature. And the protein, the fiber, the water is stripped out through the processing. And now they are rapidly absorbed into our gut, into our brain, in our mouth. And one of the things that was most striking to me when I first started doing this work is when I thought of naturally occurring foods. Naturally occurring foods will be high in sugar, like a banana or berries, or high in fat, like those meats or nuts. Sugar and fat don't come combined in high levels of naturally occurring foods. The fact that, so many of the foods that we consume, like cookies and chocolate and pizza and French fries, I was telling Claire today, I found there's a Reese cup with a potato chip in it. Okay, like that doesn't exist in nature. That combination of sugar and fat, so rapidly absorbed, enhanced by salt and other flavor enhancers, is a uniquely novel substance that we have created. And who's actually created it? Big Tobacco. Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds in the 1980s, when the going got tough around tobacco being a health concern and seen as addictive, intelligently diversified their portfolios by buying up food companies, Kraft, General Mills, Hawaiian Punch, and they took their knowledge base, both from marketing and flavor additives, and that they used to optimize nicotine to make it a highly addictive, arguably the most addictive substance out there, and applied that to their food portfolios. R.J. Reynolds, when the going got tough around obesity in the mid-2000s, that divested of their food portfolio. Philip Morris is still creating many of the processed foods we eat today. From 1980 through 2007, when our food environment went off the rails, number one producers of processed foods was Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds. So it is literally the same companies and same people who created cigarettes, who have created this class of foods that now dominate our food environment. But there's this question, how do we tell if these foods created by Big Tobacco are actually addictive? What is the benchmark here? And I would say that one thing that I hear from a lot of people is the idea that there's a biomarker, that we can look at the brain and say, oh, the brain did this. We know this is addictive because the brain did this. We don't have that. We don't have a biomarker to tell whether someone's addicted, and we don't have a biomarker yet to tell us whether something is capable of triggering addictive substance. That doesn't exist. What we have relied on are certain sets of psychological and behavioral responses to products to help us identify whether something's just a bad habit or just healthy for you. We're actually able to trigger forward a feed-forward compulsive addictive process that makes it hard to manage or control over. And so I've been kind of saying, I feel like in my world, we spend a lot of time saying, okay, I think there's people who show signs of addiction in their eating. And that feels kind of clear, right? We can see people have loss of control, intense cravings, continued use despite negative consequences, the hallmarks. But now the debate really seems to be on, but is it just the act of eating, or is it actually certain foods or something about these foods that are truly addictive in this way we would say with something like cigarettes? So I said, what I've done for most of my career is say, what are the benchmarks that we've used scientifically to understand other addictive substances? And let's apply them in the context of this food environment to help us evaluate. And so I looked to the 1988 Surgeon General's report in a paper that'll be coming out in Addiction in a couple weeks, where he said, what were the benchmarks around cigarettes? Cigarettes, there was a hot debate whether tobacco could be addictive, right? It's legal, it's easily accessible. It was the biggest export coming out of the United States for generations. The USDA was involved in creating the most effective tobacco plants they could for creating cigarettes because it was such a huge part of our economy. And it was killing millions of people, and it wasn't intoxicating. You could drive your car, watch your kids, smoke your cigarette. It doesn't look like alcohol or heroin or other things, right? A huge debate about it. The 1988 Surgeon General report was kind of a watershed moment when they said, here's the scientific base that these are not just bad habits, as we've been calling them, but they're actually addictive substances, and we should be treating them as such. So we have now taken 4 benchmarks that I'll walk through with you today, and we've looked at the evidence base for highly processed foods, also relative to minimally processed foods, to understand, do they meet these scientific benchmarks, which have stood up to over 30 years of evaluation that we've used with tobacco? Say, are these really addictive? So the first primary criteria in the Surgeon General's report was that the substance was able to trigger compulsive use. And with cigarettes, kind of said, the most striking version that this is really compulsive was that people would know they had emphysema or lung cancer, or would have had to have a tracheotomy, and they would want to quit. They knew it was killing them, and then they would keep smoking, even though they wanted to. That most smokers wanted to cut down or quit, and most couldn't. When we look at that in the context of these sort of highly processed foods, it's clear that they can trigger compulsive use. Most people, millions of people go on diets to try and change their intake of these foods every single year. The vast majority fail in the long term. We even see in the context of gastric bypass surgery, where someone's had a very significant surgery to reroute their stomach, anywhere from 20 to 40% of people regain the weight after the surgery, in large part due to cravings and desire for these highly processed, highly rewarding foods. And that occurs even though there's dumping syndrome, where you eat the food and it's too fatty and it's too rich after bariatric surgery, and you get ill. It's like anti-abuse. You're like vomiting, you are sick, and yet the compulsive intake continues. On a more spectrum level, we clearly see millions of people every year getting diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, with heart attacks, and are instructed by their professionals, medical care providers, that they need to change their diet. Most people are not able to do so. So clearly there's a compulsivity here that is maps very neatly onto what we see with things like tobacco. We've also been measuring kind of compulsive intake in my lab, and another way, which is we developed the Yale Food Addiction Scale in 2009, which takes the diagnostic criteria for substance use disorders, and it just applies it to the intake of highly processed foods. And so it asks about things like, do you experience a loss of control over your intake? Do you experience cravings and inability to cut down even though you really want to? Are you continuing to use even though you're having negative consequences physically or emotionally? Do you show tolerance? Do you feel like you need more and more and more of the food to get the fix, or a more intense version of the food? Do you show withdrawal when you try and cut down? Are you irritable? Do you feel kind of down, or your cravings really heightened when you're trying to cut down on these sorts of things? This scale really just mimics kind of a diagnostic decision-making that we do if we did a skid on a substance use disorder. It has 0 to 11 symptoms, and there's a symptom count version of this scale where you can see how many symptoms does somebody need in a dimensional way, and a diagnostic version of this scale that mimics how we do a diagnosis of substance use disorders. 2 or more symptoms plus clinically significant impairment or distress. You can do mild, moderate, or severe. When we look at the prevalence of highly processed food addiction based off of the diagnostic criteria for substance use disorders, we see that about 1 in 3 adults in clinical samples for overweight obesity are meeting the food addiction criteria based on our scale. If we just look at a general population, not a clinical population, 14% of adults are meeting the YFAST food addiction criteria. And if you think about other easily accessible legal addictive substances, the estimates for alcohol use disorder is about 13%, tobacco use disorder about 14%. So hitting kind of that same prevalence mark. Something unique to these foods is that children are getting exposed to them massively. We know that children and adolescents, over 50% of their caloric intake is typically these sorts of highly processed foods. In contrast, cigarettes, alcohol, cannabis, usually not getting exposed till adolescence, early adulthood. When we look at children, we see that 19% of children in samples who have overweight are meeting for the food addiction criteria. And if we just look at a general population of children, 12%. So this is not something that's just impacting adults, but that we're seeing this addictive phenotype around these foods across the developmental span at about the prevalence rates we see with things like alcohol and tobacco use disorder. But some other questions is the so what of that? Okay, great. I told you that did something on a scale. Are we done? No, clearly not. So some of the things we've looked at are the mechanisms that we think about as being really key in other sorts of addictive profiles. Are they associated with this highly processed food addiction? So this is a study from that I didn't do from a group in Canada, where they found that after controlling for age and income, food addiction was associated with urgency. Negative urgency typically has the strongest association in much of our scales, and delayed discounting. So we're seeing kind of inhibitory control, especially in affectively hot situations, is correlated with this food addiction profile. If this is truly an addictive disorder, we should see it kind of presenting with other addictive disorders, perhaps. So like with gambling. Gambling used to be in the impulse control disorder section of the DSM. We all know DSM has lots of caveats associated with it, right? We're like, it's like kleptomania. It's just impulse control disorder. It's like pyromania. And then they shifted it into the addiction group. They actually had to rename the addiction part of the DSM from substance dependence and substance abuse to addictive disorders, because there is no substance in gambling, right? And so with gambling, one of the pieces of evidence is that gambling co-occurred a lot with alcohol use disorder, with smoking, with things like that. And so this is my doctoral student, Lindsay Hoover, who looked at this in a community sample where we looked at YFAS food addiction, and we looked to see how much did it co-occur with high-risk alcohol based on the audit, smoking based on the FTND, and vaping based on like the e-vaping FTND. And we saw that for high-risk alcohol use, the adjusted risk ratio after controlling for gender, age, socioeconomic status, it all hung up and hung on the adjusted and unadjusted analyses, was about 2.13 times higher in individuals who met for highly processed food addiction, 1.86% higher for individuals with smoking, and 2.71% for individuals with high-risk vaping. So this does appear that this food addiction phenotype is more likely to co-occur with other sorts of addictive disorders. We also looked in this study for family history. So again, one of the things we saw in gambling was that a family history of alcohol use disorders, a family history of addictive disorders, was overrepresented in samples who were gambling. And what we looked at here was for the individuals who had high-risk food addiction, how many of them had parents who had problematic, risky drinking based on the family tree questionnaire. We saw that the risk ratio for a family history of addiction for individuals with highly processed food addiction was 2.35 times higher. If we compare that to the folks who had high-risk alcohol use disorder, it's heightened, as you would expect, a risk ratio of 1.73, but that food addiction is actually higher, more closely associated with a familial risk of high-risk alcohol relative to even alcohol itself. We kind of got like interested, why would that be, right? It's substance to substance. Not everybody drinks, right? Not everybody, especially if you had a problem drinker at your parents, you might choose not to drink, or you might know your risk is higher. We don't get to opt out of the exposure to the food environment. So that some of that risk profile might be showing up in food for folks who might pivot away from alcohol. So again, does this tell us anything clinically, right? Is this relevant to what we would think about in the clinic of who's responding? So this is a study I also didn't do, but from a group in Southern California who did this big trial called Diet Fits. And it was trying to figure out, is low carb diets or low fat diets better? Essentially, they all shook out in the wash. But what they found out is they randomized about 600 adults to a 12-month low fat or low carb diet for weight loss. They did baseline psychosocial and demographic factors. And then they did stepwise logistic regressions to identify baseline factors associated with who dropped out of the study, which was about 1/4. And then of the people who completed, about 18% of people gained weight rather than lost weight during the trial. So can we predict at all who are the people who are most likely to have these core treatments to our traditional trials? And what they found here in this stepwise logistic regression, they put all of this in: age, education, outcome expectancies, self-efficacy, diet type, social functioning, general health. Food addiction was the best predictor of who was most likely to drop out of treatment at a odds ratio of 1.43, higher than any other one, while accounting for all of these simultaneously. When they looked at who was more likely to gain weight, to have a poor treatment response, again, food addiction is the best psychosocial predictor at 1.46. And this has been found in a number of different weight loss treatment trials where food addiction is predicting folks who aren't responding to our traditional approaches to trying to help people manage their weight, of saying, eat this, but not that. Right? It's more complicated than that. Probably these mechanisms of reward, cue reactivity, emotion dysregulation, inhibitory control difficulties, trauma. We've seen associations with food addiction with all of these things. But these are people who want to lose weight, who are enrolling in these RCTs, and they're not doing well. Right? So again, that compulsivity side. So to pivot slightly, when we first started doing this work, we called it food addiction because we didn't really know what the heck to call it, right? It was back in the early 2000s. I think our research at this point has clearly borne out, and I'll present some of this data, that it's not all foods. People aren't compulsively eating celery or beans, to the point where they can't manage it. And we've really been trying to dive deeply into that idea of what foods is it? What should we call this thing? Food addiction is a misnomer. We need to think about what is the right term, because we all need food to survive. It's like saying, drinking addiction when people aren't getting addicted to water, but Coca-Cola and beer and wine may be a different story, right? And so we've really been looking to what we know about how we create addictive substances. We know that a heightened dose of a reinforcing ingredient is predictive of addiction potential, but also the rate of absorption is key, absolutely key. If we give people slow doses of nicotine, that's a nicotine patch, it's a treatment. People don't really get addicted to their nicotine patches. It's the rapidly absorbed cigarette smoking intake pattern that's really addictive. And so when we've looked at the food supply, as I've kind of mentioned to you, my doctoral student, Erica Lafava, used to go by Schulte, who's at Drexel University on faculty there. We really tried to say, with these foods, the dose of reinforcing ingredients like sugar and fat is elevated, and the rate of absorption, the bioavailability of those nutrients is increased in these really processed foods because they're pre-texturized, they're pre-broken down. There's no fiber, there's no water, there's no protein. Think about how long it takes you to eat a banana, right? And to get the sugar in that banana. And then it takes a while to get absorbed in the gut because you're fat. If you think about that same amount of sugar and a handful of jelly beans, boom, right? It's immediate, and both how quickly you can eat it, how rapidly it gets broken down, and how it hits your body and your brain. So when we've asked people to fill out the why fast, and we haven't prompted them on what foods, we just said, we want to know about these behaviors: loss of control, continued negative consequences, craving, withdrawal. And then we ask them, rate which foods for us are most problematic in that behavioral profile. Here's some of our top 10. None of these should be surprising, right? No one's like, chocolate, really? I'm shocked. Like chocolate, ice cream, French fries, pizza, cookies, all foods that have unnaturally high levels of refined carbohydrates and added fats that are typically also enhanced by other flavor enhancers, and that are all processed so they can be rapidly consumed and rapidly absorbed into the body. Guess what's not rated highly? These foods: apples, salmon, black beans. There may be an aversive effect if you over binge your black beans. And the things we look at is like, these foods do have sugar in them, right? Apples have sugar in them. Bananas have sugar in them. They're at the bottom of the list. The delivery, salmon, high in fat, but the delivery vehicle, the way that they are delivered into the system is so distinct from our processed foods. Nicotine is in eggplant and cauliflower. Like, we eat nicotine, but the way it's delivered in those packages, we're not all getting high on eggplant all the time, right? So the way it's delivered into the system is key. So here's some of what we're seeing, that it's really this class of foods that people struggle with. So the second criteria, so I hope I've kind of given you some evidence that highly processed foods are consumed in a compulsive way, that people want to quit and they don't. That's the first criteria in the Surgeon General's report. The second one is that they're psychoactive, which means that there's transient effects on the mood as mediated by the brain. And so we all clearly need calories and we need to eat. But what we see in some of our qualitative work and our other work that we've done with individuals who have high YFAST scores is it's not about the calories. It's not about the homeostatic hunger. It's about a lot about the reward and the emotion. So here's 2 quotes from a qualitative study we did. My doctoral student who's now graduated, Emma Schistel. For me, the main emotional outcome of the eating is intense pleasure while it's happening. The emotional thing is big for me. I definitely eat this stuff to feel better. And so when we think about motivations to consume alcohol, like if we think of even ours to say, oh, you got broken up with, pint of ice cream, bottle of wine, it's this idea that it's not about necessarily the calories, but about the affective shifts that it causes and pleasure and reducing negative affect. And to look at this even a little bit more specifically, the way this was proven, and tobacco, one of the big sources of data, was this euphoria subscale of the Addiction Research Center measure. When they administered 1.5 milligrams of nicotine directly into a vein, people would report, okay, I got about a 6 on that scale. It heightened people's sense of euphoria at a 6. Clearly, smoking tobacco isn't as euphoric as being on opioids, right, or being on ecstasy, but it is shifting mood in these subtle ways, causing this subtle euphoria. People, Casperson has done a lot of work at the USDA, giving people different sorts of chocolate and using the same scale. You can see 1.5 milligrams of IV nicotine is a 6, and her study with chocolate, white chocolate with no caffeine or anything in it, is a 7. 38% cocoa chocolate is a 6.6. So when it comes to that measure with euphoria, psychoactive changes with these sorts of foods relative to nicotine, it's on par. Also, in contrast, when you gave to me, this was smokers, the 1.5 milligrams of nicotine, you give that to non-smokers, you know what the euphoria effect is? 1. They're like, that was, if anything, aversive, right? Chocolate's a pretty universal. There's not a lot of people rating that as a 1, right? So there's this greater kind of exposure level. So it is shifting mood. Is it impacting the brain? So my colleague, Dr. Alex De Feliz Antonio, who's at Virginia Tech, who's a neuroscientist, has done this beautiful figure, she and Dana Small, that have kind of mapped the mechanisms from the gut into the striatal reward and motivation system of the brain. And what we see is that when fat is absorbed in the gut, it goes up through the vagus nerve and it activates dopaminergic release in the striatum. Carbs, we don't know all the ways that the pathway is going, but it's starting to suggest that while fat kind of has one way through the vagal nerve, carbohydrates have multiple different pathways up to the striatum of the brain through the gut. And that makes sense. We're primates, 80% of primate diets is carbohydrates. So we are kind of really designed to be sensitive to that carbohydrate profile. It's not just through the gut. On animals, if you give them oral sucrose, oral fat with sham feeding, it never gets to the gut, you will see activation in the striatum of the brain. But is it the same? I'm telling you it's activating the reward system, but like clearly amphetamines, cocaine, like 1000% release above baseline of dopamine in the striatum of the brain. Well, again, we look to nicotine, we look to alcohol. Well, amphetamines and cocaine are like a release of dopamine in the striatum of about, over 1000%. And nicotine and alcohol is around 150 to 200% generally. That's the amount of dopamine release you see in the striatum. Much more subtle than what you see with dopamine agonists. So then what about food? We see that the level of release and reward-related circuitry in response to sucrose, fat, and processed food combinations, whether delivered purely orally with no gut signal or just into the gut and bypassing oral, releases the same magnitude of dopamine release in the brain as nicotine and ethanol. So yes, is it amphetamines? No. Is it as high as nicotine and alcohol? Yes, it is. It's almost identical in the magnitude of dopamine release in the brain. So the third criteria is it highly reinforcing? Will people work to get it? Will they self-administer it? Will they go out of their way? And one of the biggest ways that we looked at this in the context of nicotine in the Surgeon General's report was based on animal models of what they would self-administer. And nicotine's actually a really hard reinforcer to make animals care about. Usually they'd have to kind of starve the animal or really do intermittent reinforcement or pair it with sugar before the rat would administer nicotine. And when they compared, they forced a rat to choose. Do you want the cocaine or do you want the nicotine? The rat, not surprisingly, would go for the cocaine over 80% of the time. right? But they would still administer the nicotine. It was clearly reinforcing. If we look at those same sorts of animal models with sugar, with sweet taste, in contrast, rats will choose the sweet taste almost 90% of the time over cocaine in forced choice tasks, even if the rat has been showing signs of dependency and gotten hooked on the cocaine through prior exposure. And then they ask them to choose, they're going to choose the sugar 90% of the time. You can see here, this is Serge Onfed's work, individual rats. This is the one little dude who's real into cocaine. Is hanging out here with sugar, and one person's like, I like them both, right? So when we think of this same marker that we use to say nicotine is a powerful reinforcer, I mean, it can't always compete with cocaine, but some of the times it can. Sugar is blowing it out of the water. It's even higher than cocaine on that marker that we use to identify that tobacco products were addictive. What about in humans? So we see we have there's a reinforcement value task. Lynn Epstein's done a lot of this work in his group, where you do the rat lever pressing test. We use it in my lab. How many times will you press this boring computer tab to get some chocolate? Okay, now it's going to get harder and harder, and the progressive ratio in which you get the chocolate goes up and up and up. Generally, we'll see that people will press, I think we have a study where people press over 1,000 times to get access to junk food in a fast food restaurant, French fries and cheeseburgers and milkshakes. In contrast, when we're like, who wants to press for salad? They're like 30 times. I'm like, I'm good, I've done enough. So we're seeing that people work on this, but one of the work that I think is really fascinating that Jennifer Temple is doing is that there's sensitization effects. So we see with addictive drugs, the more you expose the animal to it or the human to it, the more sensitized they get to wanting it. Even if they don't get the same euphoric effects, even if tolerance is popping up, they will want it and they will work hard to access it. In contrast, we see things like ketamine, which may or may not, maybe has a mild addictive potential. We're unclear. Ketamine doesn't seem to sensitize systems in the same way. It releases dopamine, but doesn't sensitize it with repeated doses. In contrast, this is women at risk for obesity, and they gave them every single day for 2 weeks, 300 calories of a highly processed food, and then did their reinforcement value before, which is in the black line. And then after the 2 weeks of consuming it every day, they're like, I'm sick of this food, but their reinforcement levels went up and they would work harder over time to gain access to that food that they had been dosed with for 2 weeks. In contrast, you cannot sensitize people to vegetables. They have tried, the reinforcement value goes down. They're like, great, we'll just sensitize everybody to vegetables. People are like, please stop giving me carrots. I will not work for this, get it out of my face. So this is something, again, that's specific to these sorts of foods. And if we look even before obesity onset and we look at teenagers, there's individual variability, just like there is with other substances. Most people who use addictive substances don't get addicted, right? Like it's a rarity, actually. Like cigarettes is our most prevalent one, that the percentage of people who go on to get addicted is about 1 out of 3 in tobacco. It's about a little over 10% for alcohol, cocaine. There's an individual difference factor here too. Those teenagers who are most prone to sensitize to these highly processed foods, they're the ones who, if you follow them for a couple of years, they gain weight more rapidly. And so this suggests that this reinforcement sensitization is playing this key role in kind of risk profile for reward-driven eating. All right, so the fourth criteria that has been kind of added to the Surgeon General's report based off of the last 30 years of science, this wasn't originally in it, but has been proposed as just as central, is that the substance can trigger strong urges and cravings. And this has been really included because we see that craving plays a huge part in the clinical phenomenology, right? Like it's now a DSM criteria. We see that craving is a better predictor of a tendency towards relapse than is the amount of pleasure you necessarily get when you're consuming the substance. So urges and strong craving seems to be really important. When we look at the brain circuitry, this is a meta-analysis done by Tang, and they looked at what are the neurocircuitries overlapping when you look at people in the scanner who are craving highly processed foods relative to drugs of abuse. The circuitry is overlapping at over 80%. And it's these kind of key reward circuitry of the amygdala and the striatum. That this like circuitry, when you're craving foods, when you're craving addictive substances, it's using pretty similar circuitry in the brain, which isn't surprising, right? Our brain isn't like, here's my food reward mechanism, and here's it's the same kind of mechanism that's being amplified. And what is the most craved foods? All highly processed. It's chocolate, it's chips, it's those same foods that I show you. People will crave fruits and vegetables. but if anything, it predicts better outcomes. They sleep better, they have more nutritious diets, they have less loss of control eating. It really seems to be the craving for these highly processed foods that is really clinically meaningful. And in a meta-analysis done by Boswell and Kober from Yale, they looked at the effect sizes for different craving measures, whether it's Q reactivity measures, imaging measures, tonic craving, state-based craving for highly processed foods. And then they looked to see how it predicted different sorts of clinical outcomes, from weight outcomes, eating outcomes. The overall effect when averaging across all these different studies was a moderate effect size of over 0.3. So clearly this craving for these foods is clinically meaningful and predicting people who are struggling to respond to our traditional treatments. So in summary, when I kind of come back to this idea of, are these highly processed foods addictive? If I use the scientific criteria that we use to say tobacco, killing millions of people every year, we're telling everybody it's just a bad habit and they need to cut down, it's bad for them, and people couldn't, oh wait, this isn't just a bad habit, it's actually triggering addictive circuitry. Those exact same criteria I propose are met when it comes to compulsivity, psychoactivity, reinforcing, and urges and cravings for highly processed foods. And again, when we look at the database for minimally processed foods, they're not checking the boxes in the same way. So if you're interested in this, we have a paper that'll be coming out and addiction in probably a few weeks that is like really dives into the depth for each of these criteria and compares highly processed to minimally processed foods. So I've kind of, my lab, we found, yeah, these things look like an addictive substance based on established benchmarks. We have a lot of future directions. This is clearly a scientific area that we have more questions than answers. I think one of the biggest one is what term is best to use. So Tara and I talk about all the, there's a million terms out there right now to describe the sorts of foods that I showed you people are struggling with. Hyperpalatable is a great term with excellent scientific base. We've always used highly processed based on the addition of the refined carbohydrates and the fats, given they seem to be the ones that are linked to that reward circuitry. Ultra processed is a term that's getting a lot of focus, but there's tons of debate about it, huge debate in American Journal of Clinical Nutrition on it. So we've got to figure out a term because we're all just kind of using a different, I use different terms in different papers. I'm driving myself nuts with my inconsistency because I'll read a paper and I'm like, yes, hyperpalatability, that's it. Oh no, maybe it should be different. We can't decide. So as a field, we have to figure out what is the term. We all kind of know the foods we're talking about, but we got to figure out what is the best term and operationalize it really clearly and start using it consistently. I really want to apply psychopharmacology methods that we've used to disentangle cigarettes and what makes them addictive and other addictive drugs to understand highly processed foods. Right now, we treat them as food, right? They're food. They're just like an apple or chicken breast. I would argue these highly processed foods have more in common with cigarette than they do an apple. Clearly, they were made by the same people, the cigarette, right? So we know that it's not just about the nicotine of cigarettes, but how they've been optimized through the delivery mechanisms and the additives and the somatosensory profiles. We take menthol out of cigarettes without touching nicotine. It's thought to save millions of lives if people are not starting cigarettes or just not finding it appealing anymore and quitting. That's not messing with the nicotine. It's the overall formulation of the delivery vehicle. With these foods, clearly they're complex, right? Same thing. Complexity is what we do in addiction. We need to kind of disentangle and start kind of isolating these parts and treating them like the highly refined, optimized substances that they are and understand how they've been created and made to the people. Treatments, I'm showing you people with food addiction are not doing well in these treatments. We don't really have a lot of treatments specifically focused towards that group. There is psychopharmacology evidence that's kind of compelling with naltrexone and bupropion, and psychopharmacology we use in addictions also appear to have an effect when it comes to binge eating and food addiction. So that's possible. When we look at a lot of our psychosocial treatments, we're doing the same things, right? We're like, what are your triggers? How do you develop alternative coping strategies? But I really think we need to dig into the craving, the inhibitory control, episodic future thinking, regulating emotions in this subgroup, because like just normalizing their eating, like with this subgroup just isn't, I don't think fully going to capture the phenomena. And there's fascinating work on the other way. Vygotsy is this like blockbuster treatment that's come out for psychopharmacology that triggers insulin systems, and it is the most effective treatment for obesity we've had outside of bariatric surgery. there's anecdotal reports coming out where people who are on that for food are saying, I stopped drinking. I've lost my urge to drink or to smoke cigarettes. And we know that the gut hormones that impact hunger and satiety have a direct message way up to the reward systems of the brain. If we're altering those gut peptides, we might see improvements as well in other substances. So that's going to be something to look at. There hasn't been good science yet, but the anecdotal reports are compelling. Effects early in development. I should be like 12% of kids, 7-8-year-olds are showing this clinical profile. We know that in utero exposure is the norm. We know that by the time, we know the younger you are when you're exposed to addictive substances, the more vulnerable you are to developing problems with them. We have never think about addictive substances that toddlers are being exposed to on the regular. By the time a child's 2, they're more likely to have an added sugar food or beverage than they are a fruit or vegetable on any given day. What do we do about this? We have to think, we know prevention is more effective than treatment. We have to take this down the developmental trajectory. And then food insecurity is an area that we've really been looking at. Food insecurity is a high stress group that shows high levels of obesity and binge eating. And we know that their food environment is even more saturated than the average American in highly processed foods, because that's what's available and affordable and cheap and convenient. And so my graduate student, Lindsay Pronouskis, has been doing this work. We just published a paper, our first paper on food insecurity and its association with food addiction. And as you know, all those things I just kind of told you why we think this group might be at heightened risk, and food insecurity is growing in America, especially in COVID. In 2 different samples, one in California and one in Michigan, we saw that pregnant individuals and food insecure households were 21% more likely to meet for the food addiction criteria, and caregivers and food insecure households in Michigan were 56% more likely to have food addictions, high food addiction scores. It isn't surprising, but like, what an important sample. I give the example that like, for a long time, from like the 1800s to like the early 1900s, and still in developing countries around the world, our water supply was so polluted that people couldn't drink water. So they had to, even kids were drinking beer and wine because it was fermented and safer to drink. And we see this now in Mexico, where the water isn't safe, and a lot of people drink soda because it's safer to drink than the water. And we knew that kind of the poorer you are, the less likely you were to have access to clean water and have to rely on addictive substances, alcohol, wine, beer, to get hydration sufficiently to make it through the day. I would argue our food supply is kind of similarly polluted, and with foods that damage physical and mental health, and that's particularly true if you're food insecure or from a community of color, where we know that targeted marketing is particularly high. This is a social justice issue. We deserve to be able to access nourishing foods and not to be inundated with marketing and advertising for foods that don't promote health. So this is the last thing I'll leave you with. Why should we think about addiction? I mean, these foods are unhealthy, right? No one's like, oh, I have a chocolate ice cream with marshmallow swells and caramel was like a health food. Like, I'm shocked. We know this is unhealthy. Why don't we just focus on this? This is bad for you. And again, I turned to tobacco about why go into the realm of addiction if it's scientifically warranted. Why mess with this topic that can be a little prickly? Well, the Tobacco Institute, which was a cover group for tobacco, the tobacco industry said the entire matter of addiction is the most potent weapon a prosecuting attorney can have in a lung cancer cigarette case. We can't defend continued smoking as a free choice if the person was addicted. And right now, where we're at with people is it is an adult free choice that people are just making, where they're eating these foods and they should stop. And we're not acknowledging that, just like with cigarettes, you're targeted from the moment you're a little kid, and that we don't know the risk profile when it comes to reward signaling and addiction of these. It's not just this, pure willpower choice here. And so I'm going to leave you with this, which is this thought experiment, which I've been thinking about recently, is pivoting. I keep being like, I think these foods are addictive. Here's all my evidence. Well, we've seen that when there are addictive substances that we do not realize or acknowledge are addictive, and we let them flood the marketplace and be heavily marketed, particularly to kids, millions of people die. We've seen it with oxycodone, we've seen it with tobacco, we see it with alcohol. We're making very little progress. What is the evidence that these foods are not addictive? Where's that evidence, right? So, they contribute to hundreds of thousands of preventable deaths every year in the United States alone, on par with tobacco. They are consumed compulsively, craved intensely, trigger dopamine release in the same magnitude as nicotine and ethanol. They're highly reinforcing, at least on par with things like cocaine, based on our animal models. If this was a new product given to the FDA to evaluate for whether it was too addictive to be on the market, it would fail instantaneously as having too much risk and not enough benefit. This is just a thought experiment. What is the evidence base that this is a non-valid framework? I'm not sure. So thank you for listening to my talk. This is my lab at the University of Michigan. Some of my doctoral students I mentioned, the Red Center for Food Policy and Obesity at the University of Connecticut is providing me with a lot of initial support and funding. My funders at NIDDK and NIDA. And then because I was in the bar lab in my doctoral program, and I built my lab at Michigan, I built a simulated fast food restaurant. Because we know cues and context are so powerful. And we do see people eat about 500 more calories in our simulated fast food restaurant as they do to a normal lab space. It enhances positive expectancies for the affective impact of these highly processed foods. And people in this environment will work a lot harder to gain access to unhealthy foods than they will in neutral environments. So that's my alcohol kind of addiction full story. So that's a lab website. All the scales I mentioned today are on there, freely available, downloadable, and all our papers are available and linked there in other talks. So thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
First of all, the obvious, what a wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Absolutely. So exactly 3 days ago, the New York Times published an article, I think,
Yeah.
and it was well sourced, very much. They describe atypical anorexia nervosa as all of these people who don't eat, but they're obese. They're always begins with food addiction.
Oh, interesting.
They don't call it food.
Yeah.
They describe histories of these food addictions, but they can never lose the weight.
Yeah.
As well as much as they start. So and we see that in clinics all the time where people, they journal every single thing they eat.
Absolutely.
Every calorie. They don't lose weight. What can you explain about that process?
So this is one reason why when I started doing this work, obesity was just used as a proxy for this behavioral phenotype. That's like using lung cancer as a proxy for cigarette addiction, right? Some people smoke cigarettes, never develop lung cancer. Some people have lung cancer and don't necessarily didn't smoke cigarettes, had other exposures. Obesity, our body, once we gain weight, it wants to hold on to that metabolically. And I think that we've tried to say this food addiction is elevated in individuals with overweight and obesity. Not everyone. We see individuals who have normal weight, who have this relationship with food, and either through a lot of them are young, high metabolisms, it's coming for them, right? The metabolism slow down, it's not great. Or they're exercising a lot or fasting. And so we focus on that. I really feel that that would be such a high suffering situation because we know that the body, when it's in a hunger state, is priming the reward systems of the brain to be more reactive as it's starving. And so if the metabolic signaling and how the body is maintaining weight has adjusted in response to the food and the weight, that's going to be a hellish way to try and sort that out. Now, this would be my theory, and I've been talking about this some with other folks. Kevin Hall had this really beautiful study at NIH where he brought people in for 2 weeks and he gave them all ultra processed, highly processed foods, same person, and put them in an environment that was on minimally processed foods. The environments were matched for overall caloric intake, overall macronutrient content the best they could. People just naturally, in the minimally processed food, eat 500 less calories a day. And their hunger and satiety peptides and their hormones started working more effectively. And they lost about, what was it? I think it was like 10 pounds in the 2 weeks that they were put in the minimally processed environment. And so I think we've been obsessed with calories and we haven't been paying attention to the quality of the food and the way it's delivered. And so I see so many people when they try and eat processed diet food, it's actually still crap. And when we see non-artificial sweeteners have reward profiles on par with what we see with nutritive sweeteners, I focus a lot on trying to make the quality of the diet mostly real, whole, minimally processed foods. Now, our society is not set up for that. I mean, we have to do it on a societal level. We know with addictive epidemics, the more it's convenient and heavily marketed and cheap and all you need to have is a moment of temptation, and it's right there. We're trying to not just get people to reduce their intake of the highly processed foods, but increase their intake of minimally processed foods. Not only are they more expensive, but they are so much more work, right, to clean and to prep. And I'm a mom of 2 kids, like, so I want a frozen pizza. I'm like, I am tired. We've got to think about ways we can make it so the default and the amount of inhibitory executive control we are requiring of people to eat healthy, real food is not such challenging. So I think that's what I would think about, but that is a condition that it has a lot of suffering.
Follow-up question to that, so part of the treatment for both atypical anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa is to help people eat foods that they've been afraid to eat, because the fear that is reconciled. Right? So like sometimes it's like, you know, I'm so afraid to eat an Oreo cookie, that they're, you know, engaging in all kinds of behaviors to avoid it, all kinds of maybe inaccurate beliefs about cooking and being never stop. So part of the treatment does involve exposure to your foods. How is that done or introduced in the context of your research? Because part of it is introduction of highly palatable food. Without it, almost like this message of like you can only eat, you know, healthy foods, and there's a bad foods and a good bad foods. It's like very reinforcing this psychology. So how do you integrate this work with eating this?
I mean, I think it's a great question that we haven't fully looked at. So I do like eating disorder treatments with folks. Like when we're like, I feel like there's a concerning message. If these foods do have this addictive pull, there's a reason I think people develop these extreme rigid boundaries to try and get control of these sorts of foods, in part clearly because of diet culture and thin ideals that are toxic and need to be let go of. But also the foods are really rewarding and reinforcing, so you always need to grab onto those things to manage those foods, because it's hard to eat just one. I mean, that's the whole marketing gimmick. What does this mean then for treatment? We know a lot of folks that, you know, clearly we don't want people in either extreme. We don't want people where their entire life is having this tiny, rigid 7 foods they can eat, where I would argue, overreacted to a food environment that is challenging to manage by grasping on to these rigid structures that then take over their life. On the other hand, just being like, no, there's no difference in these foods. All foods fit. There's nothing different about this bowl of ice cream, this bowl of salad. I think is not being honest with our clients. And they know that. Like, they're not like, oh, really? You know, I think deep down. And we've seen some of it, like a lot of people with anorexia do still have in recovery, even do have certain foods that they don't eat all the time. So I think we need to move into this harm reduction gray space, right? That's about, we do want to expose your foods and increase your range and increase your flexibility and your variability, where your life is not just this tiny rigid group, and to maybe acknowledge that for some of these foods, based on their personal history, they could be at risk for then transitioning to bulimia or transitioning to binge eating disorder or developing this addictive profile, possibly, that we should at least monitor and be studying. So I think that should we be doing exposures? We need to break that down. And I think we can do that in a way that isn't like all these foods are created equal and now 100% of your diet. If we saw somebody we were treating for anorexia and they came in 10 years later and they gained, you know, 200 pounds of high diabetes, and we looked at their diet and it was all pizza and french fries, so you'd be like, oh, but they'd be like, well, all foods, you know, like they're all created equal. We don't actually practice that way, I think, you know, and so I think there's a gray area and a middle ground that we can start working with. And I think harm reduction approaches that we've used in substance use disorders to think about flexible, moderate use and trying to reduce risky intake, which sometimes you say substance is not a variance of risk. The Bacardi 151 is far more risky and potent than low alcohol beer. You may never be able to integrate Bacardi 151 back in as somebody who's doing a hard reduction approach to alcohol. Can you maybe have a glass of wine or a beer in safe context and situations and learn those skills? For a lot of people, they can't. You know, and I think with food, maybe for some people, trying to get them to moderately consume double chocolate chunk Ben and Jerry's ice cream and keep it in their house, that may just not be for them. But can they eat this wider range of foods than this little list of 5? Absolutely, we should encourage that. So that's how I've been thinking about it. I think it's a great question. I don't think how much evidence.
I think we actually want to ask. You mentioned about the food addiction
Mhm.
phenotype.
Yeah.
So if you list
Yeah.
the
Mhm.
hyperpalatable food, let's say,
Yeah.
order, and then the non-hyperpalatable food is like top order, right?
Yeah.
So I look at
Yeah.
the list. So Tara and I have been doing some pilot work as a baby, working for
Yeah.
hyperpalatable and non-hyperpalatable. Okay.
Yeah.
So Tara, you have not really, this is just preliminary, data that I saw. We have not run any analysis yet, but I literally watched every single video.
Yeah.
Those baby. Okay, so my question for you is, when do you think this phenotype come on board?
Yeah.
Okay, so let me tell you
Yeah.
why. So if those baby can answer questionnaire.
Yeah.
Your questionnaire.
Yeah.
Your attention.
Yeah.
I can tell you, for sure, based on what I have seen, they work equally for both
Oh, that's interesting. And that's true across all babies.
all babies.
That's
Weight.
interesting.
So far, we look at some weight.
Yeah.
The dietary intake takes a long time.
Yeah.
And know what to really have.
Yeah.
exposed
Yeah.
to. But I look at it as that,
Mhm.
at first we say, okay, let's recruit 30 babies.
Yeah.
And see if we can see anything.
Yeah.
Tara, I couldn't see anything. Let's recruit another 30.
Yeah.
60 babies.
Yeah.
I cannot run more than that.
Yeah, that's a lot of babies.
A lot of work. And couldn't see anything.
Well, that's interesting. So we've done some qualitative work. So we've done a couple things. So the full-blown addiction phenotype, when we've done qualitative work, folks will be like, I was always had strong reward drive for food. I wouldn't say I was fully addicted, but I would sneak the food out of the cabinet, and it's always the highly processed foods. I'd hide it in my bedroom. I'd steal money from my mom so I could go get it. I always had this high, strong reward drive, but it didn't really start to emerge in a way that I really felt like I lost control until adolescence. And then early adulthood, when I went into college or I was responsible for my own food environment, that's when I realized I thought I could be able to shift back, and I was not able to. And much like tobacco, people will, alcohol people will age out more when developmental shifts occur. With tobacco, we don't see the aging out in the same way because it's not toxic. With the foods, people in our qualitative work said, this middle life, when I have kids and a job and I'm busy and stressed, is the worst my addictive pull of these foods has ever been. And now I realize I have diabetes and I cannot get this under control. We do see variability. I work with Julie Lemay and we do these R1s. We do see that mothers who have food addiction have babies who have more rapid weight gain at 6 months. So I think that it's interesting to ask ourselves how we can best conceptualize this with babies, and if there probably will be critical periods. Now, we do like a RRB task, and the order effects were epic. Whatever the baby worked at first is they worked like crazy for that, and then when we did the within subject, they were like, I'm bored. And so we've struggled to really get the methods right. So I can't wait to talk to you about that. But when we look at 6, 7, 8-year-old kids, we are seeing that 7% of them are reporting meeting the full addiction phenotype. If we bring them into the lab and give them access to like foods, they eat more overall calories out of limited intake above and beyond their body mass. Then in adolescence, when we bring them into the lab, we see that they start monitoring because they know they're in a study. And so then the restraint behavior starts to make it a little bit more of a complicated phenotype. But I can't wait to talk to you about this more because it's interesting to think what would it look like in these kids.
Yeah, they're not.
Okay, yeah,
12 months.
No, 100%. And I do think that the dietary explosion is going to be really important. So look at animal models, the pups of dams fed really highly processed diets, they show reward sensitization, dopamine changes, enhanced motivation for stimulants, amphetamines, and high fat, high sugar foods. But particularly when they are then weaned onto the highly processed diet themselves. And for 12 months old, it's still a pretty milk heavy diet. They're not getting the chocolate and the candy and the fruit. Like I think the 2, 3, 4-year-old stage, when they start to look like an adult diet, is when it's going to emerge. Because I think it's individual risk times repeated exposure to the substance. That's my guess.
Yeah, another area that my work is in babies. We can see the different shade between working for food versus non-food.
Yeah.
But when it's food, like
That's interesting.
and then you always hear moms who say,
yeah, it's so hard for me to get them to come to eat the food when they poison or they're engaging with some other things is so hard, like especially babies, the first 3 years. You know, I think it's the environment they are in that causing all this.
I'm looking forward to talking. I would also propose, I know we're out of time. Family history of alcohol use disorders associated with more potent preferences for sweetness at more intense levels in babies and kids who've never, I don't think they've done it babies, and kids who've never been exposed to alcohol themselves. So it appears to be a familial factor rather than an alcohol exposure effect. That family history of alcohol, it would be really interesting to look at familial risk for addiction, to look at this individual differences. We'll talk more.
All right, I think we were up on time. Thank you so much, Dr. Gearhardt.